Jim Sciutto is joining us. He's the author of this book. It's the Madman Theory. Trump takes on the world, and he's got his own take on what happened with Peter Navarro when he was speaking to him about all this. Hey, Jim, good to see you. Your read on what we're seeing here.
Well, listen, and I provided to your colleague the full transcript of the exchange on Canada. It was, in fact, Mr. Navarro who brought up Canada as I was questioning him as to why the administration often uses the same cudgel with its allies as it does with adversaries. And regarding Canada, I pressed him. I reminded him of all the soldiers who died in Afghanistan. I personally have been embedded in Afghanistan more than a dozen times, and I saw Canadian forces on the front line, and I'm well aware of the sacrifices they've made. I reminded him that Canada invoked, along with other NATO allies, the NATO Mutual Defense Charter after 9/11. I pressed him as to whether he made a distinction between Canada and, say, Russia in terms of behavior. So it was a lengthy conversation on this with multiple opportunities to make distinctions where Mr. Navarro just wasn't willing to do. And the thing about this is really, it's a feature, not a bug, of the way this administration often looks at allies. You've covered, as I know, the many disputes with NATO allies, the ongoing dispute with South Korea over contributions to the force deployment there. So it's a realignment, really, of the way the U.S. looks at these relationships under the Trump administration. This is not an outlier view here. It's part of a larger view.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is a guy who, as we know, has courted controversy and sort of an us versus them mentality, and perhaps kind of typical of Peter Navarro?
Well, listen, I've had many conversations with him over time, both in person and over the air, and he has a, you might say, pugnacious view of many of America's relationships, as the president does as well. For instance, when we were speaking, I reminded him as well that the president himself declared Canada a national security threat, remember, to justify the imposition of steel tariffs. So, again, when you hear these comments from someone like a Navarro, or public comments, tweets from the president or other advisors, it's part of a worldview here where they see U.S. allies as having taken advantage of the relationship, and they see themselves as correcting, as it were, fundamentally imbalanced relationships. That's the view. And the truth is, when you speak to others inside the administration, for the book, I spoke to more than a dozen current and former senior Trump administration officials. They often echo this. And others inside the administration who critique it say, for instance, with the president, they've had trouble convincing the president of the many benefits of alliances, the history, the shared values, interests, etc.
What I really like about the title of your book, and we're just going to bring up the cover again for folks watching across the country, is the Madman Theory. And so, just let me just condense it here. The idea that, you try to out-crazy your adversaries by pretending you're crazy, that you're a madman. Richard Nixon goes back to the 70s. And so this is the idea. And I think a lot of people, when Trump got into office, Jim, in your country and around the world, said, well, maybe this is what's going on. He's not really crazy, but he wants them to think he is so that they back down whenever there's a confrontation. Tell us a little bit about the stuff you found out in this book, because it's just kind of fascinating to get an inside scoop.
Well, for one thing, yes, the president claims to keep the other side off balance, and claims that, like in The Art of the Deal, this sometimes can win him the day, or all the time, in his view, win him the day. The fact is, when you look at the record, by and large, it's failed. With North Korea, they have more, not fewer, nuclear weapons. With Iran pulling out of the nuclear deal, it is closer to a nuclear weapon, not further away, more hostile in the region. China, though this administration has certainly stood up to China on many fronts, has not become any less aggressive. And you could say the same for Russia, although the president has a very different approach to Russia here. So the other factors that are distinct to Trump's madman theory is that he's just as likely to unleash it on allies as on adversaries, as Canada has its experience with the steel tariffs and comments like this, but also even his own advisors. And this is the thing. For this book, I spoke only to people who served at the senior level of the Trump administration, and they recount many episodes where the president surprised them with decisions for which there was no preparation, no discussion, no debate, and often decisions that not only surprised them, but contradicted stated U.S. policy. The withdrawal from Syria, for instance, two times the withdrawal of U.S. forces from Syria. The president refusing to call out Russia for putting bounties, for instance, on U.S. forces in Afghanistan. These are things that his own advisors were surprised by Trump's madman, as it were. So that's the innovation, if you want to call it that, about Trump's approach to the madman theory.
So you got this book, The Madman Theory, and I'm also familiar with The Shadow War, which came out last year, about Russia and China and trying to outmaneuver the United States. Jim, based on all the reporting you're doing, the conversations you have, tell me whether, the criticism is real, that this administration, this president, they're kind of making it up as they go along, that there isn't really a cohesive strategy to deal with the Chinese or the Russians or allies, for that matter.
Well, don't take my word for it. If you read the book, you hear it directly from people who served him at the highest levels. National security advisors, senior Russia advisors, senior officials at the Pentagon. They describe not just the disruption of the national security decision-making process, but the end of it. That they say that there is no more policymaking, that the policymaking follows the president's decisions, which often are by the seat of the pants, often by tweet only without any discussion. They speak openly about the destruction of this process, which is a remarkable thing to see, because you have a president who not only dismisses the advice, oftentimes, of senior advisors or intelligence that is presented to him, or the analysis of agencies such as the intelligence agencies, not only dismisses it or ignores it, but often attacks it as fundamentally untrue. He doesn't believe it. He's, for instance, with the Russian bounties on U.S. forces, he says, well, maybe that's another Russian hoax. He's, of course, famously dismissed U.S. intelligence finding on Russian interference in the election. So that is a remarkable dynamic for a commander-in-chief, not only to dismiss those around him whose job it is to advise him, but sometimes to attack them and just call it false, call it fake news, call it a hoax. It's a consistent, again, like the dismissal of allies, it is a feature, not a bug, of this presidency that national security decision-making process has been set aside. It's a remarkable reality.
Jim Sciutto is CNN's chief national security correspondent, author of this book. We're going to show it again, The Madman Theory. Trump Takes on the World. And you should check out The Shadow War as well from last year. Another great book by Jim. Hey, wonderful to have you with us in Canada. Appreciate you taking the time, Jim.
Thanks so much. I lived in Canada before. I've got great memories from there.
Appreciate it. All the best.